There comes a moment quiet, uncomfortable, almost unsettling when you begin to realize that no one is coming to save you. Not the perfect mentor, not the ideal partner, not even some future version of yourself who suddenly has everything figured out. And this realization is not meant to discourage you. It is meant to wake you up. Most people spend years, even decades, waiting for the right opportunity, the right support, the right timing. But what they are really waiting for is permission to begin, to change, to take ownership. And that permission never arrives. Life does not operate on fairness or convenience. It responds to action, not intention. Psychologically, this waiting is a defense mechanism. It protects you from responsibility. Because if someone else is supposed to come and fix things, then you are not accountable for where you are. But the cost of that comfort is stagnation. You remain in the same place, telling yourself a story that relief is just around the corner, when in reality you are standing still. The truth is far more demanding, but also far more empowering. You are both the problem and the solution, and once you accept that, something shifts internally. You stop looking outward for rescue and start looking inward for capacity. You begin to ask different questions, not, who will help me? But what can I build with what I have right now? This is where real growth begins. Not in ideal conditions, but in imperfect ones. Not when everything aligns, but when nothing does, and you move anyway. Because the moment you stop waiting, you reclaim time, energy, and focus. You step out of passivity and into agency, and it won't feel comfortable. In fact, it may feel isolating at first, but that discomfort is a sign that you are no longer sedated by illusion. You are awake, and awareness always comes with a certain weight. So understand this clearly. The world does not owe you intervention. It responds to those who take responsibility without being asked. No one is coming, and that is exactly why you must begin. Once you accept that no one is coming to save you, a more difficult truth begins to surface: what you feel, what you carry. And what has been done to you may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. This is where many people hesitate, because it seems unfair. And in many cases it is. You may have been ignored, betrayed, manipulated, or left behind at moments when you needed support the most. The instinct is to hold on to that injustice, to point toward it as the reason things cannot change. Psychologically, this is understandable. As Carl Jung often suggested, the psyche resists what it cannot immediately reconcile, and pain left unprocessed tends to become identity. But there is a hidden danger in this. When you define yourself through what was done to you, you unconsciously give it authority over your future. The past becomes not just a memory, but a governing force. And while it may justify your current state, it also quietly imprisons you within it. Taking responsibility for your pain does not mean excusing what happened. It does not mean pretending it was acceptable or deserved. It means recognizing that your healing cannot be outsourced. No one else can process your thoughts, confront your patterns, or rebuild your sense of self. That work is deeply personal, and it requires a kind of honesty that most people avoid. Because when you begin to take responsibility, you are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How have I allowed this to shape me? Where have I repeated the same cycles? What am I avoiding by holding on to this story? These are not easy reflections, but they are necessary ones. There is a shift that occurs when you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What can I do with this now?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. It moves you from a position of passive suffering to active transformation. And in that space, something powerful begins to emerge. Not because the pain disappears, but because it is no longer in control. You begin to reshape it, to use it as material, rather than allowing it to remain a weight. So understand this clearly. Holding on to blame may feel justified, but it keeps you dependent on the very thing that hurt you. Your pain may not be your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. At some point, you will notice a pattern in your own behavior and inconsistency between what you intend to do and what you actually do. You tell yourself you will begin tomorrow, that you will act when you feel ready, when the energy is there, when the conditions are right. But those conditions rarely arrive in a stable or predictable way. This is where most people place their trust in motivation, and this is also where most people quietly fail. Motivation is emotional. It rises and falls with your mood, your environment, even with something as simple as how well you slept. It can feel powerful in the moment, almost convincing you that change is inevitable, but it lacks endurance. It cannot sustain action over long periods, especially when the work becomes repetitive, uncomfortable, or invisible to others. Discipline, on the other hand, operates on a different level of the psyche. As Carl Jung might frame it, discipline is an expression of conscious alignment, a decision to act in accordance with a chosen direction. Regardless of emotional fluctuation, it is not dependent on how you feel. It is anchored in what you have decided matters. This distinction is critical, because if your actions are governed by motivation, then your progress will always be fragile. You will move forward in bursts, followed by long periods of stagnation. And over time, this inconsistency begins to erode your sense of self-trust. You start to question your own words, your own commitments. But when discipline becomes the foundation, something stabilizes. You begin to act even when there is resistance. You follow through not because it feels good, but because it is necessary. And in doing so, you send a different message to yourself, one that says, I can rely on my own behavior. This is not about intensity, it is about consistency. Small, repeated actions carried out over time reshape your identity far more effectively than occasional bursts of effort. You are not building a moment of success, you are building a pattern of reliability, and that pattern becomes your strength. Because when you can act without needing to feel inspired, you remove one of the greatest obstacles to growth. So understand this clearly. Motivation may start the process, but it is discipline that sustains it. If you cannot control how you feel, then learn to control what you do and let that define who you become. After you begin to act with discipline, another experience inevitably follows: distance. Not just from others, but from the constant noise that once shaped your thinking. And this is where many people become uneasy, because what they interpret as loneliness is often something far more significant: isolation as a necessary condition for transformation. We tend to associate being alone with lack, as if connection is the only state in which we can grow. But psychologically, the opposite is often true. Continuous exposure to other people's expectations, opinions, and reactions can dilute your sense of self. You begin to adapt, to perform, to become what is acceptable, rather than what is authentic. And without realizing it, your identity becomes a reflection of external influence rather than internal clarity. Isolation interrupts this pattern. It removes the immediate feedback loop. There is no applause, no criticism, no validation to lean on. And in that silence, something initially uncomfortable begins to emerge. You are left alone with your own thoughts. For many, this is precisely what they have been avoiding. As Carl Jung emphasized, the parts of ourselves we refuse to confront do not disappear, they simply operate beneath awareness. Isolation brings those elements closer to the surface. It forces a confrontation with what he described as the shadow, the unexamined aspects of your personality, your fears, your contradictions. This is not an easy process, but it is a necessary one if you intend to develop any form of psychological depth. Because real growth is not just about adding new habits or achieving external goals. It is about integration, understanding who you are beneath the roles you play and the expectations you have absorbed. And that understanding requires space. It requires moments where you are not distracted, not performing, not seeking approval. In this way, isolation is not a punishment, it is a form of preparation. It is where you refine your thinking, where you question your assumptions, where you begin to separate what is truly yours from what has been imposed upon you. And while it may feel uncomfortable, even unsettling at times, it is also where a more stable and grounded sense of self begins to form. So when you find yourself alone, resist the urge to escape it immediately. There is something within that silence that cannot be accessed any other way. Isolation is not where you lose yourself, it is where you finally meet yourself. As you move deeper into discipline and isolation, another realization begins to surface, one that quietly reshapes how you relate to the world. You start to see how much of your behavior has been guided not by your own inner compass, but by the need to be seen, approved of, and validated. And once you see it clearly, you can no longer pretend it is not there. Validation is subtle. It does not always appear as obvious praise or recognition. Often, it shows up in more hidden forms: the desire to be understood, the need to be agreed with, the discomfort when you are misunderstood, or the urge to explain yourself so others feel comfortable with your decisions. Over time, this external orientation becomes a quiet dependency. But psychologically, dependency on validation creates fragility. When your sense of worth is outsourced to others, your stability is no longer internal, it fluctuates based on feedback you cannot control. A single comment can elevate you, a single rejection can collapse you. And in that instability, your actions begin to shift away from truth and toward approval. As Carl Jung would suggest, this is a form of psychological imbalance. When the ego becomes overly identified with external reflection, it loses connection with the deeper self. You begin to live as a response to others rather than an expression of who you are, and in doing so, you slowly abandon your own authority. The shift away from validation does not happen through rejection of people, but through recentering your internal reference point. You begin to ask a different question before every decision: not will they approve of this, but is this aligned with what I know to be right for me? That distinction may seem small, but it changes the direction of your entire life. Because when you stop negotiating your identity for acceptance, something important happens. You become less reactive. You are no longer easily pulled off course by praise or criticism. Your sense of direction stabilizes. You begin to act from clarity rather than insecurity. This does not mean you stop caring about others. It means you stop needing them to define you. And in that space, a quieter but far more powerful form of self-respect begins to develop. One that is not dependent on applause, but on alignment with your own values, even when no one is watching. And over time, that becomes unmistakable in your behavior. You no longer perform your life, you live it. So understand this clearly. The moment you stop asking the world for approval is the moment you begin to take ownership of your existence. Because validation may make you visible, but self-approval is what finally makes you free. When you begin to detach from validation, and when your actions are no longer dependent on emotional motivation or external approval, something quieter but far more demanding takes its place: consistency in the unseen. This is where most people stop, because there is no immediate reward here, no applause, no recognition, and often no evidence that anything is changing at all. But this stage is where identity is truly forged. There is a psychological truth that most people avoid confronting. What you repeatedly do in private becomes what you inevitably become in public. Not what you declare, not what you intend, but what you sustain when no one is observing. This is the space where character is built, not through dramatic moments, but through ordinary repetition. As Carl Jung often emphasized, transformation is not a sudden event, but a gradual integration of behavior into identity. In other words, you do not become strong in a single breakthrough moment. You become strong through countless unnoticed decisions to continue when stopping would have been easier. This is why building yourself alone is not a romantic idea. It is a demanding psychological process. Because in solitude, there is no external structure to rely on. You must become both the observer and the executor of your own life. You set the direction and you enforce it. And when no one is watching, your discipline either deepens or collapses. Most people underestimate how powerful invisibility is. When there is no audience, the ego has nothing to perform for. And in that space, your true priorities are revealed. Do you continue, or do you negotiate with yourself? Do you act, or do you delay? These small internal decisions accumulate quietly, shaping the trajectory of your entire life. Relentless building does not mean constant intensity. It means refusal to abandon direction. Even slow progress, when consistent, creates irreversible change. And over time, that unseen effort begins to manifest externally, not as sudden success, but as a level of competence, stability, and self-trust that others eventually recognize. But by the time they see it, the real transformation has already happened. It occurred long before, in moments no one noticed, in decisions no one applauded. So the question is not whether the world is watching you. The question is whether you are watching yourself closely enough to remain consistent with what you claim to be building. Because what you build in silence will eventually define the noise around you. And when that happens, you will understand a simple but irreversible truth. You were never waiting for recognition, you were becoming inevitable.